record. So, whoa, crazy. All right, so today we are going to be spending some time talking about the proposed intricacies of our semantic memories, as well as the varying conceptual models that have been proposed to try to help us better understand what semantic memory is and how it works. And so, as you hopefully will remember, our semantic memory is the category of memory that we say holds our factual information. And this factual information, it doesn't have any sort of timestamp to it or like location geotag to it or anything like that. But rather, it's just more generally our knowledge about the world and its details for things that aren't unique to us. So this is why, you know, trivia nights in bars happen, or there's Trivial Pursuit, you know, these games where collectively people can come together and compete about how much trivia that they know. So it's not necessarily one person has this specific unique knowledge, but rather it's knowledge that can be accessible to anybody. And so many of these semantic memory models were developed because the psychologists and the computer scientists of the day, like we're talking like late 60s, early 70s, they were really interested in the field of artificial intelligence. So what was becoming AI at the time. And so again, you know, using computers as sort of this analog for understanding how humans work, the work that they were doing in the AI field, it led people to be really curious about, well, how do people retrieve facts and information? Is it like a computer? Is it different? What does that look like? And so essentially what these semantic models of cognition, of human cognition that we're going to talk about, what they entailed is these researchers wanted to include a way to understand how sort of our common sense abilities as humans come into play with our semantic memory. And so the idea here is that, well, we know that our explicit knowledge for fact-based information is actually associated with a great deal of implicit knowledge that we just, you know, because it's implicit, we're not really consciously aware of it. And we often just take for granted. And so again, this idea that, well, these distinctions that we talk about between explicit and implicit memory, they're not quite as clear. And so how could we make a model that might help us better understand that? And so as an example of this sort of interaction between our explicit and implicit knowledge, let's take the example of everyday routines. So like something like taking a shower and washing your hair. So if you've ever looked at the shampoo bottle, they have these very literal instructions of wet your hair, apply the shampoo, and then lather, rinse, and repeat. And so if you literally followed these directions, right, if you acted on the explicit knowledge that you have of those instructions, you would be just lather, rinse, repeat, lather, rinse, repeat, lather, rinse, repeat until the shampoo bottle was totally empty. So, however, hopefully most of us are a lot more efficient with our showering, and we know we have implicit knowledge that draws on our own personal previous experiences of taking a shower that actually we don't really need to do exactly what that bottle says, right? We don't have to complete this cycle until the shampoo is run out, but rather maybe one, you know, application of shampoo, maybe two, depending on how long you've showered, or, you know, if you've gotten like peanut butter or bird poop in your hair or something, you know, like maybe you'll do 2 rounds of shampooing. but again, your implicit knowledge is enough to tell you how to go about navigating that situation, in spite of instructions that then might be telling you otherwise. And so our vast knowledge of language and concepts, like I said, it seems to have a great deal of connections to this implicit knowledge that we have. So as an example, I have a question I'm going to pose to you. Anyone can chime in. Do Bernese mountain dogs have livers? What do you think? Anybody? Anybody?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Noah, for volunteering. Why? How do you know that?
Because I feel like I've definitely seen a diagram of a dog anatomy, any general dog anatomy, and I'm assuming Bernese Mountain Dogs are similar, so they also have a liver.
Right, exactly. That's exactly what you were doing just there. So because you have these assumptions, you use these inferences, you have this implicit knowledge, you are able to assume from your understanding of animals and dogs and anatomy that, well, Bernese mountain dogs are dogs, and then dogs are mammals, and mammals are kind of animals that have livers. And so the semantic models that we're going to talk about regarding how our knowledge is represented in memory is really focused on how we go about making these sort of inferences or these assumptions that we have based on our pre-existing knowledge, and sort of demonstrates what we kind of colloquially call our common sense. Also, it was not until preparing this lecture that I learned that it was Bernese mountain dogs. I had lived my entire life thinking that they were Burmese mountain dogs, like Burma, which used to be the name of Myanmar. So anyway, you really do learn something new every single day. So let's talk about a general assumption that we need to understand moving forward as we talk about how these models were developed and built. And so to build these kinds of models, we need to make some inferences about how we represent information mentally. So for example, if we can retrieve information really quickly in comparison to others, so let's say, for example, if I asked you to think of all the words beginning with the letter L, that is going to be a much quicker task than if I asked you, well, think of all the words that have L as the fourth letter in them. And so this suggests to us that there's some sort of organization that is involved in our knowledge, right? Things are organized in this sort of reasonable, rational way, and it's also something that's more efficient. And we also have within cognitive psychology that this organization is I just lost my train of thought. But the organization is carried out by way of what are called lexicons. So they're essentially these collections or these like mental dictionaries that we have. So for an example, our lexicon for words that begin with L, it's like its own sort of standalone dictionary. So you could really just kind of go through and be like, light, lemon, lemonade, loser, light speed, things like that. You could just kind of go through as if you were sort of reading entries off from a dictionary. And so again, this is one of the concepts that's sort of underlying all of these models that we'll talk about, is that there is some sort of inherent built-in organization system to the way that our semantic memory works. And the idea is, well, there has to be some sort of efficient way of storing that information, right? We don't just throw all of that semantic memory into a drawer. You know, if you have a junk drawer at home, you know, how impossible is it to find something in there versus a drawer that maybe you have that's more organized, you have it, you know, set up maybe by, okay, you know, all of the utensils go in this drawer, you know, all of the cups go, well, it wouldn't be a drawer, but a cabinet, you know, things like that. You don't have it all intermixed, it's organized in some sort of way, so you can search through it. And so a lot of the models that we will be talking about were, like I said, developed in the 70s. This was when this sort of information processing, this computer driven analogy idea was really predominant in cognitive psychology. And so you'll probably notice that flavor. And so we're going to talk about some of the more classic models first, and then I'm going to talk more about some of the more recently developed models that have come about. So the first model that we're going to talk about, the classic model, is called the hierarchical semantic network model. It's a nice little mouthful. And so here, the idea is that, well, because our world and our language knowledge is so great, right? There's so much that we can know. There must be some sort of storage space that's very large that is required. But because, again, because these ideas were being generated in the sort of context of like this like computer boom, the analogy was thought of to be similar as computers, of like, oh, well, like computers, there must be some sort of limited storage to our semantic memory. You know, like there's only so much that we can put in that particular hard drive, so to speak. And so that's what's going to be driving this model. And so the thought here is that, well, one way to conserve the memory space would be to try to avoid storing redundant information whenever possible. So really keep it streamlined. Don't have duplicates of things. And so, for example, the idea that if we were to look at a diagram, kind of diagramming different things that we think about that are related to Bernese Mountain Dogs, like having a liver, or has puppies, is black and brown, things like that. There are certain aspects of that that essentially we want to have like shortcuts to. So like as an example, if we have the just sort of more general broad information of gives birth to live young, which is something that describes mammals. And we know that, well, Bernese Mountain Dogs are mammals because dogs are mammals. We don't need to repeat that feature or that feature along with every sort of category. So with mammals, it's enough to just say, well, mammals have live young, and then from there say dogs. And we know that that is applicable to dogs as well. They give birth to live animals, they don't lay eggs. And that continues down, it sort of trickles down and also applies to the categories underneath it as well. And so this then illustrates this idea of there being this cognitive economy. And so the properties and facts that are more broad and applicable, they're going to be stored at the higher levels of the hierarchy. And so there was this landmark study that was done by Collins and Quillian in 1969 to test this idea. And so kind of how they ended up fleshing out this idea of a hierarchy is they talked about it, they talked about semantic memory, that is, as essentially being like a network of these connected ideas. And this model kind of really set the stage for a lot of the the future models in terms of like the language they use and how they understood different concepts. But as is the case in like later semantic models that we'll talk about, this one consists of what are called nodes. And so each node corresponds about roughly to individual words or an individual concept. So here on the slide, we can see that each of the words that are, and it's not a box, but it has rounded corners, the yellow that is surrounding the words here, canary, ostrich, bird, animal, fish, etc. Each of those represents its own node, its own concept. And then each node is then connected to related nodes by the way of some sort of link. And this is, again, based on association, right? We associate that a dog barks, a dog wags its tail, that a fish lives in water, that a fish has fins. So we have these concepts and then related information that's connected to them in this semantic network. And so, and again, so there's this idea that there's a collection of these nodes and that they are all interconnected in some way to one another, and that they are then holding our semantic memory in this network. And so Collins and Quillian, they really wanted to look at this idea of cognitive economy. So really trying to understand, well, do we actually use this very streamlined form of information in this hierarchy? And so their reasoning here was that, well, if semantic memory is similar to this network of nodes and these connections, and if cognitive economy is what actually is an important operation in our semantic memory, then the closer that a fact or a concept is that's stored to a particular node, right? The closer that wags a tail and barks is stored to dog, then the less time it should take for us to recognize and verify that information. So again, if barks and wags a tail is really closely related to dog in our semantic memory, then if I ask you, does a dog bark? You will very quickly be able to tell me yes or no. And so in their study, the way that they investigated this is that they presented people with a number of similar sentences. And as they found, it took people less time to respond to sentences that had representations that were closer together. So as an example, the sentence, I'm going the wrong way. The sentence, a canary is a bird. So here, canary and bird are only two levels in this hierarchy apart from one another. So they're closer, and therefore being able to verify whether they are actually connected or not is a lot faster. Whereas for the sentences that had more than three levels, say more than these levels, say 3 levels, they had to look higher up in the hierarchy to see the connections. It took longer. So another example is, well, a canary is an animal. And so in this instance, it takes longer to get to the connection between canary and animal, because you have to go through 3 different levels. You have to go through canary, and then to bird, and then to animal. And so this model came to be called the hierarchical semantic network model because, like I said, these things were organized in a hierarchy. And so specifically, they're organized in these different groups or clusters of nodes that are called superordinate and subordinate nodes. And so a superordinate node, it corresponds to the name of the category that is higher up in the hierarchy. So for example, here on the slide, pets. Pets is a superordinate category because within pets, you can have a lot of different other subcategories, right? You can have cats, dogs. I don't know why in this one they put unicorns, but I thought that was funny. So I thought I would include it here because I was like, sure, pets is a unicorn. But you know, reptiles, things like that. You can have all different categories within that larger category. And then as you move down the hierarchy, you have what are called subordinate nodes. And so these are smaller categorical nodes that fall within the larger superordinate node. And so, for example, if we are looking at the node of cats, right, we can see that pets above it in the hierarchy is what we would then refer to as the superordinate node for the concept of cats. So it's the node that is above it, that is higher up in the hierarchy. And then again, looking at cats below it, when we get more specific about that category, we are talking about subordinate nodes. And so this would be specific kinds of cats, right? Siamese, Persian, Sphinx, long hair, short hair, all those sorts of things. And so sort of with this more fleshed out idea of hierarchy and how things are organized, researchers wanted to really see if they could run experiments, run studies that supported this idea of the hierarchy. And so we have the researchers Meyer and Schwanenvelt, nailed it, probably not, in 1971, who they performed a series of experiments to try to elaborate on this idea of semantic networks and how they're organized. And so their reasoning was if related words are stored close to one another and are connected in a semantic network, then whenever one node is activated, then that means that other surrounding nodes will also be activated. And so how they investigated this was they used what are called lexical decision tasks. And so in these kinds of tasks, participants are shown strings of letters and then asked to decide as quickly as possible if the letter strings are real words. And then of course they will respond yes to strings that are real words, like bread, and no to letter strings that are not real words, like rankle. And so in their study, they found a really interesting phenomenon. And so how their participants, or what their participants were required to do was they were shown two words at once. So there was one word over the other, above the other, and then they had to decide if both of the strings were actual real words or not. And so if one of the strings in the word was a real word, such as bread, the participants were faster to respond if the other string was a semantically related word, such as butter. So again, going back to this idea of, well, the bread node is activated, and then therefore connected associated nodes are also activated, such as butter. That performance would be faster than if there was a word paired with a non-word, so bread and rankle, or even if there were two real words paired together, but they weren't related in any sort of semantic way, like bread and chair. And so how they interpreted this was that there was this concept of what's called spreading activation. And it's this idea that the activation of one node continues to spread throughout the connected nodes in the semantic network. And so in this experiment, presumably when participants were reading the word bread, they then activated the corresponding bread node in their semantic memory. So all of a sudden they were thinking about bread, and then this sort of primed them or set them up to then activate other surrounding related nodes in the semantic network. So then when they then looked down and saw butter, then that node for butter was already ready to go. It was already primed, ready to go. And the processing of them providing their response was a lot faster. And so this priming effect was originally discovered by these authors and has been really, really widely replicated. And it's really important in some of the semantic network models that we'll talk about on Friday. So as always in science, we propose things and then we critique them. And so somewhat soon thereafter of Collins and Quillian presenting their model, other researchers were starting to find evidence that seemed to contradict this hierarchical model. And so in terms of this idea of cognitive economy, that is that principle that like different properties and facts are stored with the most general, the higher, more general nodes. A researcher by the name of Carol Conrad, she actually found evidence to contradict this idea. And so what she did was she had participants do a sentence verification task. So they had to respond yes or no about the truth of the sentences. So for example, she had them respond to things like, a shark can move, a fish can move, an animal can move. And so here, if cognitive economy is what was going on, then the property of can move, this idea of this more superordinate node, it would be stored closer to animal. And then these three sentences, then they should be a lot quicker to respond to. So an animal can move, that takes you X amount of time. And then because of that cognitive economy, right, the fact that can move sort of trickles down in properties along the hierarchy, you should be able to say, well, a fish can move and a shark can move even faster than responding yes to an animal can move. However, what she found was that that all of her not all of it, but overall, her participants were there wasn't any difference in their response time across those different sentences. And so this sort of flew in the face of cognitive economy and provided some evidence that, well, maybe it's more about how frequently the idea is associated with that node rather than sort of the logistics of how it's organized in this hierarchy. And so a second prediction of the hierarchical model has to do with hierarchy again. And so if the network represents words that are, again, in sort of this hierarchical order, right? So maybe we have animal at the top, and then underneath that we have mammal, and then we have pig. They should be, arranged in that sort of order. However, researchers, they actually found that participants were faster to say a pig is an animal than they were to say a pig is a mammal. And so there's this violation then in their study of, again, the sort of idea of this trickle-down effect, because the participants were quicker to say, yes, a pig is an animal, which is the label that is higher up in the hierarchy, than they were to say, oh yeah, a pig is a mammal, which is actually the label that comes below animal in this hierarchy here. And so a third problem for the hierarchical network models then is also that, well, it wasn't able to explain certain findings, specifically the typicality effect. And here, the idea is that, am I supposed to be on the next slide? No, I'm not. Sorry, I lost my place for a second. So the idea here is that generally typical instances of a concept are going to elicit responses quicker than atypical instances. So for example, if I gave you the sentences, a robin is a bird and a turkey is a bird, likely you're going to respond more quickly in the affirmative to a robin is a bird as opposed to a turkey. A robin is more typical of what we think of when we think of birds. I guess unless you are a diehard fan of turkeys or you're a turkey farmer or something like that that could influence you, generally most people would think more about a robin as being sort of a typical bird. And so again, this hierarchical network, it didn't predict this typicality effect. So then it instead, based on cognitive economy, it predicted, well, all instances of a concept, whether it's a robin or a turkey, they're all birds. It should be processed similarly because of these levels of organization. And so because of these problems, there was some reformulation of these ideas. And so that takes us to the next model. And actually, you'll see that these authors, Smith, Shobin, and Rips, they were the ones who were really critiquing Collins and Quillian's hierarchical model. And so they then proposed this alternative, and they called it the feature comparison model. And so the assumption behind this is that the meaning of any word or concept is based on the features of that concept. And specifically, features then have there are two different kinds of features. And so the first kind, defining features, these have to be present in every single instance of that concept. So for the example, birds, right? In every single instance of bird, we expect the defining feature of has wings. And then also we have this idea of characteristic features. And these are features that are usually, but not necessarily always, present. And so as an example, let's think about the concept of a bachelor. So the defining features, right? The features that have to be present for us to say, yes, that person is a bachelor, is, at least in the way that we tend to use it in everyday language, is male, unmarried, and an adult. So those are the deal breaker things. If you are not any of those things, then you cannot be a bachelor. However, we also have some other features that tend to go along with our concept of bachelor, but are not always the case. So we have these characteristic features of a bachelor is young, but we also know that, well, sometimes, bachelors stay bachelors, that, you're going to have older people, older men who are bachelors. There's also this idea of, well, a bachelor lives in like his own apartment or his own house. The term bachelor pad, right, comes to mind here in this characteristic feature. But again, that actually might not always be the case. And so there, again, just this idea that there are these distinctions then between features. So here the idea in this model is that, well, we make judgments based on comparisons between features, and there are different kinds of features that then direct our judgments. So this then brings up the question, well, how do we retrieve knowledge then if we have all these various lists of features? And so the researchers who proposed this model, they did another sentence verification study where they gave participants sentences that they had to respond yes or no to. And so the idea that they proposed about how this decision-making process was going about when participants were responding to sentences, they proposed, well, there has to be sort of this two-stage process for verification. So if we take the example sentence of a robin is a bird. So in the first stage of this, it's thought that what we do is that we look through both of the lists involved with defining and characteristic features of birds. And so if these two lists of defining bird features and characteristic bird features really overlap a lot, then we say, yes, that's true. Yes, a robin is a bird. And we say it very quickly. Similarly, if there's not a lot of overlap between these lists, then we're able to say, no, that's false. A robin is not a bird very quickly. However, if there is sort of more of an ambiguous level of overlap where it's like, well, there's some overlap, but I don't know, then the idea is that we move on to a second stage. And so this is when we then focus on these defining features, these sort of deal breakers in our minds. And so here, just the defining features lists are compared to each other. So if the lists match, then you say true. So, if we take our robin example, so let's say a defining feature is has wings. They say, well, does a robin have wings? Yeah, it does. Okay, so then that has to be true. Whereas if that doesn't line up, then you would say false. And so this is sort of this idea of how we go about making these decisions. So first we do a more general list comparison. And then if that still doesn't help us, then our backup plan is, okay, let's look at the deal breakers. Does it have wings or not? And so the feature comparison model is really, really useful in comparison to the hierarchical model because it is able to explain things that the hierarchical model was not able to. And so again, one of these things is the typicality effect that was critiqued of the hierarchical model of not being able to explain. And so again, this idea of, well, we have certain concepts that we can verify faster because they're more typical in comparison to more atypical ideas. So again, if we think about a robin versus a turkey and trying to consider whether that's a bird, robins, we encounter them more often, robins or crows or pigeons or seagulls, in comparison to turkeys or a pheasant that are less commonly encountered. And so the feature comparison model, it also helps explain why we're so quick to be able to say no accurately when these sort of sentences or these sort of ideas are incorrect. So a table is a fruit. You're able to say no to that very quickly. And the reason for that is because of this idea of this two-stage list comparison that's happening, right? And so because the list of features for table and for fruit presumably share very little entries, right? maybe you could say both are round or can be round. But aside from that, there aren't many other shared characteristics. Then you can really easily and quickly say, nope, that's wrong. And so there's also another phenomenon that the feature comparison model can explain as well. And this is something called the category size effect. And so this refers to the idea that if one term is a subcategory of another, then people are generally faster to correctly verify that sentence with the smaller concept in it, or the smaller category. So, for example, going back to dogs, people are going to be faster to say, yes, a collie is a dog, than the sentence, a collie is an animal. And so here, the feature comparison model explains this based on the assumption that, well, as categories, as they're mentally represented, become larger. So as they grow in size, so let's say from robin to bird to animal to just living thing, they also become a lot more abstract. And so then with this increase in abstractness, there then become less and less defining features. And so in the first stage of processing, there's more of this sort of ambiguous overlap. And we have to do more searching, more comparison in the instance of a collie is an animal than we do for an instance of a collie is a dog. And this model can also explain how these sort of hedges or these sort of fuzzy categories or concepts can be processed. So like let's take the sentence, a bat is a sort of bird. So most of us know that, well, there are some shared characteristics between bats and birds, right? They fly, they have wings, they eat insects. That bats are not like birds in other ways too. Bats are mammals, whereas birds lay eggs. And so the feature comparison model then explains that we carry out this comparison of features at the level of just the characteristic features, but it doesn't happen with defining features. So we are able to say and understand that, well, because bats share some characteristic features with birds, so flying, having wings, eating insects, we can agree, well, yeah, they're sort of like birds. But because they don't have this shared list of defining features, we are able to say, well, they're also really not like birds as well at the same time. So even for these categories that, or concepts that might be a little bit more ambiguous, we're able to make appropriate categorizations based on the kinds of features that we can identify. And so that sounds all well and good. Maybe this model did it and it told us everything, and the answer is always no. And so despite the successes of the feature comparison model, evidence and arguments, as always, they began to mount against it. And so one of the fundamental criticisms has to do with the idea of defining features. And if defining features, do they even exist? I mean, let's take the example of, again, birds. So most people would agree that has wings is a defining feature. But what happens if there is an accident? You know, a bird's wing gets caught in something, one of its wings gets caught in something, and you know, it gets damaged or maybe loses part of the wing, but it survives. Is it still a bird, or will we categorize it as something else since there was a change to its features? And again, it also brings up this question of, well, what is a defining feature and how can we depend on it anyway? Because if we use the concept of can fly as a defining feature for birds, then, well, how do we account for birds like penguins or emus or chickens that don't fly well, or can't fly for very long? What do we do with those? And so again, some of these pitfalls led to more model revisions. So the prototype model, which is a third model that we're talking about, it essentially is able to, or it tries to account for how we might be able to recognize that emus are birds, even though there isn't a ton of shared features with other birds. And so just as the feature comparison model, you might have thought of parallels to the feature analysis theory that we talked about in the context of perception. The prototype model here is similar to the prototype theory of perception. And so with this model, the assumption is that what we store conceptually, they're actually these combinations. Oh, sorry. They're actually these combinations or these abstractions of the most common features of a concept. And it's thought that in this particular model, our semantic categories are represented as these networks of then overlapping attributes. So sort of this Venn diagram arrangement of semantic networks. And so a member of a category is judged to belong to or be prototypical of a category if it possesses a lot of the category attributes and very few, if any, attributes of other categories as well. So kind of this idea of this prototype really needs to be distinguishable from other concepts. And so if we, and this is also sometimes referred to as this idea of this family resemblance, right? Because this one concept resembles this category more than it does other ones, it seems that, oh, that has shared features, that belongs over there. So if we go back to our robin example, if a robin is a good example of a prototypical bird for most people, then it'll have a lot of the attributes that come with the category of bird, whereas it'll have very few attributes of other categories, such as mammal or fish. And so interestingly enough, the development of our prototypes, they actually have a lot to do with our culture and our geographical location. So the prototypes that can emerge, at least in the context of this idea of that there's a prototype model, is really influenced by our personal experiences. And so the book talks about how a bird called a house sparrow, it looks something like this. It used to be the most common bird in the Netherlands, but that has been replaced. And I think climate change might have something to do with that, changes in bird migration patterns and habitats. But now the more common bird in the Netherlands is the blackbird. And so therefore, older Dutch people, they might have a totally different set of abstracted features to support a prototype of bird than those in younger generations who weren't exposed to these house sparrows as much and are more exposed to blackbirds. And we also see an influence in how we develop and group and abstract prototypical features based on our our value of that object, how we understand its importance in our world. And so, for example, there's an indigenous group called the Tzeltales. They're an indigenous group of people in Mexico, and the way that they have gone about classifying plants and categorizing plants has been on the basis of their usefulness. And so there's kind of this general demarcation between useful plants and non-useful plants. And then within the larger order of useful plants, you have, useful for cooking, medicine, and then, within medicine, maybe you have pain relief, maybe you have speeds healing, these different sorts of properties. And so the plants that are judged as not as useful, they're seen as just sort of really undifferentiated plants. They really just sort of fade in the background. If you were to ask a Tzeltale, like, well, what kind of plant is that? And if it was one that didn't matter as much, they would be like, I don't know, it's a plant. And so the idea here is that the reason why they have a particular plant prototype that comes to mind is that it's based on the attribute of the valuable plant. So again, this idea of, well, what you encounter in the real world then comes to be the internal representation that you have. And so there are a couple more models that we will talk about. And so one of them is a reformulation of the original hierarchical model. And so this was done by this model, the spreading activation model, was developed by one of the researchers who initially developed the hierarchical model, and then our ever-present Elizabeth Loftus, just a giant in cognitive psychology. And so they reformulated the hierarchical model. And so they wanted to clarify and extend the assumptions that cognitive psychologists had made about how people go about processing semantic information. And so similar to all the other models that we've talked about, they conceived of semantic memory as being a network made up of nodes that are interconnected to other nodes that represent concepts. And they took this idea of this sort of spreading activation, but they added some nuance to it. And so they believed that as this activation of nodes spread outward, so as the activation of dog and its associated nodes spread outward, it decreased in strength. So it was kind of like an ocean wave, right? When it first crashes, it's really strong, and then the further it goes from its point of origin, the weaker it is. And so they use this kind of idea similarly of, well, because of this spreading activation that weakens over a distance, quote unquote, then the things that are more closely connected are going to become more activated than things that are more distantly related. And so here I have a visual of this idea. And so notice that in this model, the way that they are understanding semantic memory, the really similar concepts, such as car and truck, they have a lot of these different interconnecting links to them, and they're really close to each other. And so the less similar concepts, such as house and sunset, which are both indirectly related to the color red, both can be red sometimes, they don't have these direct connections to one another. And that because of that, they're spread farther apart. And so again, this idea of spreading activation, right? If we were to start with red, you're likely going to think of more closely related ideas first and faster. So fire or cherries or a fire engine. Whereas things that still can be red but are farther removed, are not quite as closely connected, that activation is sort of dying off as it continues out towards the surrounding nodes. And so here, again, we're going to talk about some critiques and problems as always. The assumption behind this model is that again, essentially this idea of this spreading activation, and that is what explains the way in which we recall information. So it's not necessarily this hierarchical organization. It's also not this like cognitive streamlining, but it's really just a matter of how things are connected in our minds and our representation of them, and then which node we are activating, and then where that is spreading to. But there's this sort of double-edged sword that comes with the spreading activation model. And so on the one hand, its major strength is its major shortcoming, because, well, it's very consistent with many findings, can account for a lot of the problems that we've talked about in previous models, but it also makes prediction really difficult. So it's vague and broad, which is good, but it's vague and broad, which is bad. And so because of this, because it doesn't lend itself very well to prediction, it's kind of been relegated to more of a framework rather than being thought of this fully fledged model. And so I'm aware of the time. We have one more model that we'll briefly cover on Friday before we jump into the other models that I have planned to talk about. But any questions about today's lecture? I know is a lot more theoretical and dry, so if you got lost, know that you're not alone. All right. Well, I hope the rest of you have a great rest of your Wednesday. Have fun in lab. I know Lydia's got something great planned, as always. And I will see you all on Friday. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.